and welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today we are joined by Dr. Takahiro Yamamoto, who will be presenting on Demarcating Japan, Imperialism, Islanders, and Mobility in 1855 to 1884. Dr. Yamamoto is a historian focused on modern East Asia and the Pacific. He works at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. His publications include a monograph, Demarcating Japan, Islanders, Imperialism, and Mobility, 1855 to 1884, and an edited volume documenting mobility in the Japanese Empire and beyond. He has been broadly interested in the history of modern Japan from a global perspective, focusing on border crossing activities and human mobility. Just a kind reminder to refrain from turning on your microphones during the duration of today's recording and presentation. So Dr. Yamamoto, it's a pleasure to have you with us here today. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you very much. Let me then share my screen. All right, let me start. I'd like to thank Ms. Amani Kidd and Yokosuka Council on Asia Pacific Studies for giving me this opportunity, and welcome to you all in the audience. Thank you for coming. This talk is based on the book, the cover of which you're seeing right now, that I recently published. But given the time constraints, my talk is limited to really the bare bones of the book's argument. So please allow me to be a little bit abstract. But if you're interested, please check out the book, which comes with lots of details and stories about individuals who lived and worked in Japan or around Japan's border regions in the late 19th century, and who influenced and were influenced by the process of territorial demarcation. In his 2019 book, How to Hide an Empire, American historian Daniel Immerwahr proposes a rethinking of the history of the United States to include colonies, territories, and overseas US military bases. The metaphor he uses to describe this paradigm shift is to break away from the logo map. The logo map he refers to is the territory that we think of when we hear the word America as a single piece of land on the North American continent. And Immerwahr states that being obsessed with this as a symbol is a symbol of Americans forgetting that their country was and is an empire. The tendency to forget or omit the periphery is also very present in Japan. When most of us are asked to draw a map of Japan, we probably draw the 4 islands of Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. However, this is an extremely simplified version of the country that consists over, according to the recent data, of over 14,000 islands stretching over 3,000 kilometers. Just to put this in context, with the reference to US geography, the distance between Hokkaido's northern tip and the Okinawa island is roughly equal to the distance between the state of Maine and Florida. But we tend to reduce it to just a few islands, forgetting about the complex histories that exist in smaller islands. This image of Japan as 4 islands is not that old. In the maps drawn during the Tokugawa period, the islands known today as Hokkaido, as well as Ryukyu or Okinawa, appeared as outside Japan. From the late 19th century onwards, Japan acquired colonies or dependencies far beyond the 3 islands. Japan then lost the war, the Second World War, renounced overseas territories, and it was towards the end of the 60s and the early 70s that Ogasawara and Okinawa came back from the United States. So the country's map was in a constant state of flux for a long time. All this is meant to say that the idea of a clearly demarcated territory with a stable border exclusively governed by a single state was not a norm around the Japanese archipelago until during the recent history of Japan. My book tries to answer this question of how in this period the Japanese territorial boundaries emerged. Previous studies of this process have usually told the story of American or Western imperialists who come to Japan, enforce international law and the logic of civilization, and Japanese reactions to them. You may have heard about US Commodore Matthew Perry, who signed the US-Japan Treaty of Amity in 1854 as the quintessential example of those figures. In the face of this new diplomatic situation in the mid-19th century, Japanese political and diplomatic history emphasize the achievements of the Meiji Japan's quickly transforming the country and skillfully navigating the series of negotiations. Recent studies of Japanese colonial empire, on the other hand, tend to stress the continuities between Tokugawa Japan and the Japanese Empire. In other words, they argue that the origin of the Japanese colonial empire can be found during the Tokugawa era policies towards its peripheries. The sense of superiority and economic dominance of outlying islands or regions accelerated from the Meiji period onwards, they argue, resulting in the Asia-Pacific Empire. Either way, it is a narrative of Japanese expansion with Japan and Japanese people as the primary subject. And what my book tries to do is it builds on this and tries to shift the focus to multilateral relations and individual level interactions. The book has a starting point of 1855, mainly because that is the year when Japan signed its first international treaty that specified its international border. It was a treaty with Russia, and it was about the Kuril Islands. The line was drawn between Etorofu and Urupu Islands, with the former internationally recognized as the northeastern end of the Japanese territory. And this is one of the islands that the Japanese government today claims as one of its quote-unquote northern territories, Hokpo-ryodo, that should have come back to Japan after Japan regained independence after the post-Second World War US occupation. In the following 20 years or so, Japan drew boundaries around the archipelago through international negotiations and treaty signing. The result is that it took Hokkaido, the Kuril Islands, the Ryukyu Islands, the Ogasawara Islands by the end of the 1870s. This result was not a foregone conclusion. Although Western countries possessed superior military power in comparison to Japan and could have theoretically seized some of these or other outlying territories by force, no such result materialized. There were some instances, in fact, of Western powers attempting an occupation of remote islands around Japan in this period. For instance, in 1861, Russia tried to seize Tsushima Island that lies between Honshu and the Korean Peninsula, which is marked by the number 1 on this map. But they retreated after British intervention following the Tokugawa shogunate's request. So none of these attempts materialized. By the end of the 1870s, American and British diplomats who had resisted Japanese annexation of Ryukyu and Ogasawara eventually acquiesced or even quietly encouraged the Japanese to do so. There are limitations in considering Japan's territorialization as a dichotomy between external pressure and Japanese opposition to it. When we look at the archives of discussions by countries other than Japan about the islands on Japanese periphery, we find that there was no assumption that expansion or their expansion was the goal to be pursued. Japan was able to incorporate the outlying islands partly because other countries were willing to accept them, or at least quietly condone them. And one might even say that Western imperialist powers preferred Japanese rule over these islands over that of their rivals doing so. So that's one of the main points that the book is making. The transformation of political rule in these areas symbolized a shift in international relations in East Asia and the Northwestern Pacific. Early modern East Asian states sought to stabilize their regimes by placing diplomatic functions in the hands of actors on the periphery and border issues as a matter limited to that region. In Tokugawa Japan, I should show this. Relations with Korea were delegated to Tsushima. Satsuma engaged Ryukyu and Matsumai domain in the north, based at the southern tip of Hokkaido, what is today Hokkaido, then called Ezo, and affiliated merchants, so merchants affiliated with Matsumai domain, they dominated the indigenous Ainu people living in the island. Reflecting that relationship with respective regions and their inhabitants, these border regions had different systems of government. So there existed different kinds of local arrangements. It was an early modern form of frontier management from the Japanese perspective, where exclusive right to engage in regional trade was guaranteed by the Tokugawa shogunate as a way of financial incentive. But at the same time, it served the purpose of conflict management. The participating parties did not fully agree on how to describe their relationships to each other, including who was submitting to whom. Japan, Korea, and China all believed what it wanted to believe with regards to the status of, for instance, Tsushima and Ryukyu, the go-between agents for Korea, Japan, and China, Japan, respectively, whilst turning a blind eye to events that contradicted the narrative to their liking. It was important that individual incidents did not upset the overall structure. The existence of contradictions was not in itself a problem. Rather, it was a solution created by Japanese, Korean, Ryukyu, and Tsushima and Chinese leaders for the sake of peace. Meanwhile, the islanders benefited from trading opportunities and taking exclusive responsibility for inter-regional links. As long as both sides believed their own stories, intermediaries could stay in their contradictory position and rake in economic benefits. The creation of territorial boundaries followed the collapse of this equilibrium. In the 20-odd years between 1855 to 1876, the negotiations with Western diplomats and naval officers forced East Asian actors to face up to the existence of multiple narratives that they used to selectively employ. When these multiplicities were resolved, what remained was the set of territories belonging to a certain country, either Japan, Russia, or the Qing Empire. Diplomacy was no longer a business of border region agents. It was now centrally administered by the Foreign Ministry. The ability to expansively define the territory in the logic of a sovereign state provided the basis for the subsequent construction of a colonial empire. What I'm saying, though, is that this expansion and colonization was not bound to happen simply because the Japanese wanted it, or because pre-existing arrangements were stopping to function. Because of the geographical distance, European and North American states' policies around Japan were largely left to local diplomats and military personnel. For instance, in the 1860s, sending a diplomatic correspondence from Edo to London took about 2 months at least. In this sense, Western diplomats in East Asia had a degree of free hand, but their hands were tied by the fact that they could deploy a fraction of their country's military and political resources. Against this background, Western envoys to Japan often dared not to be the first to arrive. For example, in the winter of 1875, Meiji government sent a team of inspectors to the Ogasawara Islands, some 1,500 kilometers south of Yokohama. The purpose was to declare their intention to claim the islands as a Japanese territory to its largely Western settler population, and also to declare it afterwards to the other countries. Britain decides to send its own representative on the heels of the Japanese on this occasion. Russell Robertson, the British vice consul in Yokohama, who followed the Japanese inspectors to Ogasawara, told the Japanese official that Ogasawara Islands were too remote and the financial burden of providing protection for the British subjects living on the island would be too great if Britain were to claim it as a part of their empire. Being the first to arrive was necessary for exclusive control or privileged access in the ideas of international law, but it was a costly enterprise. Given the most favored nation status that Japan promised to give to Western countries through the treaties that it signed with these Western powers, even a second arrival could guarantee access to the port in question and trade opportunities there. Imperialists, therefore, were more intent on not falling behind rather than getting ahead. Even though the Japanese leadership was partly aware of this structure, it could not escape the fear that the offensive of the treaty powers would threaten Japan's political independence. Mind you, we're talking about a regime that is less than 10 years old, and they were still worried about how long their regime can last after toppling the Tokugawa shogunate in the Civil War. The scenario they feared was, as in this quote, that agreeing to a territorial concession or land lease by one country would lead to other powers pursuing similar interests on other parts of on other Japanese borders, carving up the land and ultimately destroying the legitimacy of Tokyo's rule. This fear, though not completely justified, compelled the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji government to fight for the possession of every outlying island, even if they understood that they had no economic value. For instance, in 1874, when proposing the dispatch of officials to the Ogasawara Islands, Okuma Shigenobu, one of the senior members of the Japanese political leadership at the time, frankly admitted that there is no gain in owning and there's no pain in losing Ogasawara Islands. Nevertheless, at the end of the following year, the Meiji government decided to dispatch an inspection team to Ogasawara Islands and notify the treaty powers that Japan intended to claim them. As represented by Robertson's remark discussed earlier, the British Foreign Office and the US State Department, both of which had in the past claimed the Ogasawara Islands, saw it as a non-issue. Another pattern of behavior we can observe is that actors at all levels tried, to varying degrees of success, to play the enemies against each other. For example, in the summer of 1861, the Tokugawa shogunate's foreign magistrates asked for British intervention to counter Russia's presence in Tsushima and was successful in making the Russians leave the island. And in the winter of the same year, they asked for Russian intervention in the Ogasawara Islands to check the British presence there. The first story is relatively well studied, so I'm going to say a few words about the latter. On 20th of December 1861, Hakodate magistrate's ship Kenjun-maru happened to be in Yokohama on a training voyage. It was carrying on board as an advisor a Russian naval officer whose name the sources do not mention. 3 Tokugawa officials visited the ship and told him something to the effect of, "We have a ship going to Ogasawara soon and to investigate the islands. Could you please accompany this mission?" The Russian officer, according to the source, declined. It looks like the request was an attempt to use Russia to check the British claim to the Ogasawara Islands. Although this did not materialize, it shows that Japan-Russia relations were not merely a clash between aggressive Russia and resistant Japan, and something a little bit more complex. Playing enemies against each other worked only in certain conditions. In the early 1870s, Tsushima officials in the trading outpost in Busan on the southern tip of Korean Peninsula resisted the Meiji state's effort to take away their trading privilege by siding with the local Korean authorities, but to no avail. In a similar vein, Ryukyuan exiles traveled to Beijing at the end of the 1870s and urged that Zonri Yamen, which is the foreign ministry equivalent of the Qing Empire, to intervene against Japan to save them from annexation, but again without success. No commitment was forthcoming from their former partners. The formation of territorial boundaries in the Tsushima Strait and the Ryukyu archipelago is a story of a demise of the Tsushima domain in the Ryukyu kingdom and their failure to find an ally to resist Meiji state's takeover of their long-held privilege. This pattern of the competition for second place and attempts to playing the enemies against each other developed on various occasions around the Japanese archipelago. National and imperial agents learned the art of demarcating and maintaining borders through negotiations over multiple territories and came to see these actions as interrelated. The fears of the Japanese leadership and intellectuals for the fall of the territorial dominance were often exaggerated, but their impact on actual policy was undeniable. For instance, in December 1870, in the suburb of Hakodate in southern Hokkaido, the Meiji officials purchased back for a price of $62,500 a 99-year land lease of 3 million tsubon. So a large piece of land has been given to a foreign merchant, and the Japanese had to buy it back. To give an idea of its scale, this space is roughly equal to today's Tokyo's Chiyoda ward, or to US geography, this is roughly the same as 1/6 of Manhattan Island. So it's a large piece of land. The lease had been given to a German merchant and agriculturalist named Reinhard Gärtner in the late 1860s under the Tokugawa shogunate, and it had survived the turmoil of the Civil War between 1868 and 1869 and the civil rounds of power transition between pro-imperial and pro-shogunate forces in Hakodate. During the negotiation, the Meiji officials straightforwardly explained their reason for wanting the land back, and I quote, "If we lend your country a piece of land, we cannot help but lend to other countries when they ask for it," unquote. In May 1875, when Japan and Russia came to an agreement over the territorial swap between Sakhalin and the Kura Islands, One diplomat there wrote in his diary that now we can concentrate on the southwest, meaning Ryukyu, essentially Taiwan. The border regions of the Japanese archipelago were connected at the level of international politics and were understood as such. Alongside the state initiative to rein in on spatial government and control over the border regions of Japan were the series of individual activities to take advantage of fluid human mobility. Governments had little control over people's movements in remote locations, and some people took advantage of it, often illegally. Some chose to become officials in order to gain wealth, power, and fame, while others achieved economic success by trading various goods across the sea outside the confines of state control. The sea routes around Japan were not easy to navigate. Shipwrecks were common due to typhoons in summer or floating ice in winter in the northern parts. The fringes of modern Japanese state were the space impossible to closely monitor for the state, given its resources against the climatic conditions. In the Kuril Islands in the northwest, which Japan acquired as its territory in 1875, the Kuril Islands were visited by Japanese officials only twice a year at most during the first decade of its rule. On the southwestern end, Ryukyuan officials who resisted the annexation were able to defect to Huzhou on the southern coast of China throughout the 1880s without being stopped by the Meiji government. The left-hand side, the picture on the left that you're seeing is the remnants of this Ryukyuan outpost that these defectors or exiles were using well beyond the Ryukyu annexation. Even though the kingdom was no longer there, they were still using what is the former outpost as their place of residence, and the Japanese government didn't really have means to stop it. Similarly, in the Ogasawara Islands, officials remained unable to prevent foreign ships from entering the islands, even though on treaty terms, the island was not open to international trade. A notable beneficiary of Japan's inability to surveil and govern its fringes was animal hunters and human traffickers. Whales, an important industrial resource in the mid-19th century, were more or less depleted in the area known as the Japan Ground around the Ogasawara Islands within a few decades. Sea otters and seals, fur seals around the Kuril Islands were also decimated by the 1880s. From the 1860s onwards, thousands of prisoners arriving on Sakhalin from inside and outside the Russian Empire succumbed to the dismal living conditions of the dysfunctional penal colony that the Russian Empire established there. Benjamin Pease, who used the Bonin Islands as one of his bases for fraud, trafficking, and all sorts of violence across the Pacific, until his likely death by murder in 1874, symbolized the perilous openness of the Pacific and tragic treatment of the human body that ensued. Violent non-state mobility in the margins of the Japanese rule in the mid to late 19th century provided a context for negotiations among imperial agents and transformed the human and ecological faces of these regions. In the late 19th century, the territorial demarcation of Japan resulted in a polity that was just as complex as the previous hodgepodge of locally embedded arrangements. So that's the main point of the book. To accept the narrative that Japan emerged at the end of the process as a territorial sovereign with a standardized border around the entire nation is to ignore the lives across the archipelago and its remote surrounding islands. The process of demarcation was complete on papers, but not on the ground. Similarly, the process of forging a nation out of diverse border residents was carried out with varying degrees of rigor and determination. So what I'm saying essentially is people tend to see there is a very straightforward line from the formation of the modern Japanese state and the Japanese empire in the 20th century. And they often kind of go quickly over the late 19th century part of the story because we know what happens in the 20th century, this really massive Asia-Pacific empire spanning across the Asia-Pacific region. But in the late 19th century, which is the focus of the book, things were very uncertain, and the Japanese political leadership were operating without having a really clear blueprint to follow. There was no guarantee whatever the blueprint they had was coming to life. So that's the little pushback that I'm making with the book towards the standard conventionally accepted narrative. Okay, that's all I have to say, I think. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any question that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yamamoto, for your wonderful presentation. So to begin the Q&A portion, I would like to start with one of my own questions. So you mentioned multiple territories that eventually became part of the Japanese, or Japanese mainland, or what Japan is known to be today. Of the territories that you mentioned, specifically the ones that actually had people on them, which do you think, which territory was the most difficult, I guess, to assimilate to becoming part of the Japanese Empire? Yeah, I think we probably know, a little bit about, or most people I think would know about, the Ainu up in Hokkaido. But yes, in your opinion, what do you think is the territory that was the most difficult to assimilate to mainland Japan?
Thank you very much for the question. This is a very difficult one. Difficult in what way? Depending on that, I think it's the answer can vary. Obviously, the assimilation of Ainu happened in a very violent form, and it took a long time. I mean, the prefecture of Hokkaido was not treated equally, even though it was a prefecture under the Meiji legal setup. And same goes for Okinawa Prefecture, formerly the Ryukyu Kingdom. And the assimilation, I don't think, was ever complete in the sense that there was always a sense of difference in terms of the policies toward these regions, and also the formal rights given to the residents there. So the assimilation was at no point really complete, and the people would probably refer to things like the education and also the conscription being applied as one of the indicators of residents there being treated on par with the mainland residents. But even with these measures, the cultural differences and the I suppose the psychological barrier of treating people from these regions as the equals, that was never really achieved. Ogasawara Islands is also a very different example, because most of the residents there, when the Japanese declared it to be the Japanese territory in 1876, they were coming from Europe and North America, and they eventually, the Japanese government, the Meiji government, succeeded in making them naturalize and become Japanese citizens. But then again, in reality, the treatment of them was never really the same as other residents of the Tokyo Prefecture. Ogasawara becomes part of the Tokyo Prefecture, but really remains in really it stays it retains a unique character that it had as a place where human mobility was very loosely guarded. So which part was most difficult? I think it's a very difficult question to answer. Different places had different difficulties, but I suppose the Ryukyu possessed a particular challenge because of the number of people living there, and also it's the place where the Japanese mainlanders large-scale settlement didn't really change the population, the breakdown of the population. So the Japanese becomes a majority in places like Hokkaido, because of the policy of settling people in. And people do migrate to settle in Ryukyu, but as far as I understand, as far as I recall, the Japanese mainlanders never became a majority, if I'm not wrong. So in that sense, there's a strong continuity in the sense that who lived there in Okinawa Prefecture. And I think that helped the prefecture retain its unique character that it carried from the pre-Meiji period. I don't know if I answered the question, but that's the best I can do at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from Vivian Ning. What are your thoughts about the use of vagueness today to resolve existing territorial issues that Japan has, specifically the Northern Territory and the Senkaku Islands?
Thank you for the question. My understanding is that the Japanese government doesn't really use the vagueness that it's there, but they're pretty much fixated on the idea that this territorial sovereignty is the rule to go by. It's kind of interesting to, at least from my perspective, it's interesting that these regions had various kinds of locally contained arrangements I was talking about. And the late 19th century is the period when this principle of territorial sovereignty overrides everything. And this is the norm that people play by. And there needs to be just one government to rule over. There's no exception to this rule, I suppose. And this is the principle on which the Japanese government, or any government for that matter, fights over these territories. So territorial disputes exist because people agree on the principle that these islands need to be governed by one country. Any ground above the seawater level needs to have one government that claims its exclusive right to be the territorial sovereign. That's the rule that everybody plays by. So to answer your question, I think the vagueness that used to exist is not what today's governments are seeing, and that is the basis on which these disputes go on. And I mean, there are instances where, for instance, around the Senkaku Islands, there is this case of, or attempt at least, of extracting resources such as natural gas as a joint project. But that kind of idea never extends to who becomes the administrator of the land. So people seems to have really agreed that territorial sovereignty and exclusive control of territory by just one government is really the only rule that should apply. And any kind of divergent arrangements, they no longer see them as worth considering. So to me, that's I suppose the main reason why territorial disputes go on, because if you if you stick with that rule, there's really not a lot of room for compromise. So I think that's part of the reasons why compromise is difficult and the disputes go on.
Thank you so much. I do want to clarify, Vivi made a clarification. I think what she's actually asking relates to the concept of vagueness that can be applied to today,
Okay.
to specific places in your
Yeah. So the vagueness of territorial status that exists in places like Senkaku The Chinese would call it Yaoyutai, right? Today, if you consider that to be a vaguely governed place, so it's a contested place, what I'm saying is the rules that they assume should prevail in these places are not really vague, right? It's the territorial sovereignty. One government needs to govern this place, and that's the role each contesting government accepts. And this is a very different setup from the pre-Meiji era, when the idea of a clearly demarcated borderline didn't really exist. It was more about people to government relations and the border agents taking charge of trade relations, and that's how they administered these places, right? So I hope that's clear. The vagueness, I am addressing the vagueness that exists today, and I hope it's the same thing that you're referring to. If you see the vagueness in today's territorial status in these remote places, the flip side of that is that people at least agree on the fact that some government has to be taking charge of it exclusively, and that's the source of the contest. I hope I'm making myself clear.
Yes, I apologize. I should have emphasized outside of the official stance. She's referring to the concept of vagueness today to be a way to possibly help with current disputes outside of the official stance.
So I think theoretically it can be applied today to, I suppose, solve part of the issues, territorial disputes that exist around Japan today. But I think politically it's difficult because the idea of territorial sovereignty that I was talking about is so deeply entrenched in people's mind. And that kind of prevents people from creatively thinking. I mean, things like, if you, for instance, in the Northern Territories, the Hokkoryodo in Japanese, the former residents of these four islands had chances to visit without having a visa, even though these islands are now administered by Russia, because obtaining a visa to visit these places imply that they accept the Russian sovereignty over it. So politically, this was not something the Japanese government wanted to do. So the Japanese government and the Russian government agreed that these former residents of the island could visit the island without applying for a visa. So that was the kind of ad hoc, or at least that's the kind of agreement that the Japanese and Russian government made in order for these former Japanese residents of these Northern Territories to revisit where they used to live, right? I don't think it's going on at the moment, but it has been going on for a while until very recently. And that's kind of the arrangement where some kind of vagueness could be applied and some kind of exceptions can be made to the idea of territorial sovereignty. And I think that's small ways in which today's national governments are making some leeways to cater to the needs and wishes of the border region residents. But in order to use it as a part of the solution for the territorial disputes, I think it's going to be very, very difficult politically.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to the next question, if that's okay. So the next question comes from Braun Davis. What policies did the Japanese government have on language in these isolated islands?
Okay. So after the territorial boundaries were drawn, or at least agreed upon between sovereign governments, obviously this isn't something that indigenous peoples and border region residents didn't always fully agree, but the governments went on anyway. And then after that, the implementation of educational policies come in, and that comes with the idea that there needs to be a national language implemented, or at least imposed on the residents. So there's the policy of forcing the Japanese language as the national language, and the denial of the local dialects and also the indigenous language of Ainu. So this becomes kind of a yardstick that the Japanese government uses to show to outside observers as well that Japan is playing by the rules of civilized nations and implementing what makes Japan qualify really as the civilized member of the international society. That's, I think, is the overall narrative. And the residents had to maneuver a very difficult situation where speaking the official language or the standard Japanese was the way to go if you were aiming for some kind of official employment opportunities. But obviously it comes with the cost of cutting themselves off from the local cultural heritage and also the local community, the previous, the older generations. So the Japanese policies force a difficult choice on the local residents, but and there's a mixed responses to this kind of setup from the local residents. Some people really see this as an opportunity to essentially climb up the social status or the career ladder. So some people take this. Some people, make effort to assimilate because that for them that's a way to improve their living conditions. And other people resist it by saying that this is, the imposition of what is not really theirs, and that amounts to the denial of their cultural heritage and so forth. So the response from the at the periphery, from the Japanese side, is mixed and complex.
Thank you so much. So Braun Davis also has another question. Has there been any attempt to establish bilingual education?
So the education policy is not really the focus of the book. I was more interested in the diplomatic negotiations and the transformation of this setup of international relations. So I have to be very general in my answer. But the bilingual policy, I don't. So I think the principle that the Japanese government stood by to when it comes to the education policies in places like Okinawa Prefecture was that everybody should speak Japanese, and the local languages was something to be something that the government frowned upon, and something that the government encouraged to speak less. And being able to switch to Japanese language was something that people used as a yardstick in terms of how much progress there was in the prefecture's path towards modernization. So my memory is a bit vague, I have to admit, and you need to really refer to more specialized literature on this. But as what I can say is that the Japanese official policy was that the national language is something that everybody should aspire to be fluent in, and being able to speak in standardized Japanese. Obviously, that standardized Japanese was also in the making during the Meiji period onwards. But this is seeing the fluency in standardized Japanese was used as the sign of how far there was the quote unquote progress in the local Okinawan society.
Thank you. I do have a question. You mentioned in some of the last few slides about human trafficking that happened in these territories and during this time period. I'm curious, who are these people that were being trafficked? Were these people that were being trafficked coming from the territories that were newly acquired by Japan and brought to mainland Japan? And what were they trafficked to do?
Okay. So here I was speaking about this one individual called Benjamin Pease, who comes from the United States, and he used to be on a whaling vessel, but then he runs away and begins to essentially run his own thing, running across the Pacific with his own ship. There are several cases of this. Some of them involves bringing Chinese laborers from coastal China region to Pacific Islands. There's Micronesia region, and engage in, for instance, the business of timber export. So laborers. So the idea was this guy Benjamin Pease brings in Chinese laborers from the coastal area of southern China, and then make them engage in cutting timber, and then produce the timber to, I think, back to China or even to a place like Hawaii. And in that way, Pease would make some economic profits. Other cases of human trafficking that the sources can show involve trafficking of women. For instance, there are a few Japanese women that the government inspector teams find living in the Ogasawara Islands in 1875, and they were brought from Yokohama as the residents in the Ogasawara Islands, and they were living as partners of local residents of the Ogasawara Islands, but sometimes not really knowing what they were signing up to, and not knowing how they're being treated, or not knowing what exactly the kind of deal was. So there are various kinds, but overall, I'm talking about people brought to the Pacific Islands from various parts of East Asia because of the activities of entrepreneurs or individual opportunity seekers who are active in the Pacific, because there weren't really a lot of regulations in place enforced by government nearby. So cases of laborers and also residents who were brought in as partners of local residents, sometimes sexually exploited. So these people were the victims of human trafficking activity who didn't really know what they were signing up to, and got exploited by the people whose ships crisscrossed the Pacific Ocean.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from Vivian Lee. Did the central government pursue different assimilation policies for Hokkaido and the Ryukyu? And if so, what were the differences and why different policies?
Okay, here again, this diverges a little bit from the focus of the book, but I'll do my best in answering from what I know. There were differences between the policies applied to Ryukyu, Okinawa Prefecture of the Meiji, and Hokkaido. In Ryukyu, the idea was to initially preserve what was there. And because the Meiji government didn't have a lot of money to spend on the development of the Okinawa Prefecture. And the initial policy was to preserve the local social fabric and the strata, the elite who were in place in the Ryukyuan society. And eventually, the narrative turns to that the Ryukyuans are not really up to the speed of development or modernization. And then the policy of assimilation kicks in. But the initial Japanese stance, when immediately after the Meiji annexation, was to preserve what is there, and mainly coming from the perspective of having to economize on the expenses of the central government. In Hokkaido, the policy is different. The focus is on making the mainlanders settle in the island. And this is because of a few reasons. One is to, I suppose, Japanize the island by changing the population composition there and making sure that the island is resided by a sufficient number of Japanese settlers to make sure that other foreign approach would not take place. Russia was known to have a desire to have a strong presence in Hokkaido. The port of Hakodate was open to foreign trade since the beginning of 1860s, and the Russian ships were the most frequent visitor there. And because of their desire to develop the Russian Far East region, they wanted to have a port that would never froze during the winter. And Hakodate was the port that was very convenient to have. So at least the port of Hakodate and also the entire island was in the grand imagination of the Russian imperialists, something that they would go after. But there was no really a short-term plan. But the Japanese were aware of that kind of Russian ambition. And even though that was very abstract, the Japanese political leadership was thinking that there needed to be a policy of settling the Japanese population. And therefore, the focus was more on sidelining the indigenous Ainu people and developing the Japanese society there as a settler colony. And cities like Sapporo, if you go there today, it's really the grid system, right? That there is very artificial, developed really the result of a city planning from top down. And this is the place where the Japanese mainland settlers were expected to live and engage in various economic activities and engage in the development of the island's resources and so on. And all of this is done through the denial of what has been there as the land of the indigenous Ainu people. So they weren't really the target of the indigenous peoples there weren't really seen as the main carrier of the economic activities, and they were silent and placed in the economically dependent and subjugated position. They were treated as, even though they were incorporated into the Japanese family register in the beginning of 1870s, they were marked as former natives, and that meant various limitations of their political rights. And they were not really seen as the main target of the education policy. Slowly, they begin to be incorporated into the Japanese settler society, but really the main policy for the Japanese government in the late 19th century, as far as Hokkaido is concerned, is to send people from the mainland and use the land that they take as the place of development, economic development, and the modernization driven by the Japanese coming from outside.
Thank you very much. We did have one more question, but we're kind of running out of time. Would you like one more question or?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Thank you. The last question comes from Yibo-san. The Japanization process of border islands seems to have involved cultural assimilation of non-ethnic Japanese indigenous people and demographic engineering, specifically the Meiji government encouraging Japanese settlers to move there. At which point would you say the Japanese national identity took root among the indigenous people of these border islands?
Thank you very much for the question. This is an interesting one, a difficult one to answer again. I mean, I don't think it's, I think it's difficult to say whether the Japanese national identity ever fully took root among the indigenous people in the border islands. But in the early 20th century, from the 1900 onwards, for instance, some of the intellectuals in Okinawa Prefecture begin to see the need to emphasize the difference between themselves and other indigenous peoples of the Japanese periphery, for instance, Ainu people, in order to claim that they are different and they have developed and they are worthy of equal treatment with the Japanese mainlanders, right? So in that way, they use the logic of how Japanese they have become in order to claim their place within the Japanese society. I would say this is the development from the 1900 onwards, and this becomes more and more pronounced in a few decades later. But not everybody agrees, obviously. People within Okinawa Prefecture towards the early 20th century and later as well firmly maintain that they need to be concerned themselves primarily as Ryukyuans or Okinawans, and that's their primary identity. So the Japanese national identity is something that never fully take root for them. But there is a movement among the intellectuals of the Okinawa Prefecture in the mid-Meiji period onwards that they need to emphasize the difference, that they saw the need or expediency in emphasizing the Japaneseness in order to demand equal treatment on par with other Japanese, or on par with the Japanese mainlanders. And by doing so, as a side effect, more or less, that they ended up emphasizing the difference between themselves and the other indigenous population around the Japanese periphery. So in that sense, I would say the around the 1900s is the period when that kind of intellectual discourse begins to gain traction and becomes visible among the Okinawan people.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yamamoto, for your time today and taking time out of your day to present for us and be with us. That was a really great presentation, and thank you so much for answering all of our questions. We really appreciate it. All right. And once again, thank you so much, Dr. Yamamoto, for your time today. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope to see you at the next YCAPS webinar and event. And of course, we would love to see you next month at the next Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you next time. Bye. FadTech's IT support and mobile internet service helps make events like this one possible. Thank you.